Welcome to this Be Better podcast, where strategy, continuous improvement, innovation, leadership, and organizational development are the pillars that drive success. In every episode, seasoned professionals share their insights, proven methodologies, and powerful tools to help you grow both personally and professionally. At Be Better, we are dedicated to your continuous improvement journey. Know better, do better, and be better. So listen, learn, apply, and unleash your potential.
All right, so we are live, Ben, and I'm very excited. I'm happy to be here with you. And as I mentioned before, we're doing this podcast, and it's just talking to friends about continuous improvement, lean. So why don't you introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about you?
Happy to. And Carlos, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to help others be better and help myself be better, using some of these lean tools. And I think lean for me has been a lifelong story. I've been very fortunate. I grew up in Kentucky in the U.S. My father, Ben Hoseus, was one of the first employees at the Toyota Kentucky facility there. It's a very short story, but my mother was working at a hotel in Kentucky, and they were just recently married and started seeing Japanese managers, businessmen coming through. And she asked them, "What are you guys doing?" I said, "We're building a car factory." And she asked, can my husband apply? Because my father was working actually at a toy store at the time. And he put an application in and was very nervous about working in an automotive facility, never had that experience growing up. And he was very glad that he did. So he joined Toyota in the late 1980s. I was born in the early 1990s, to give away my age a bit. But he spent about 13 years at that Toyota Kentucky facility, worked his way up in that world. And I give all that story, Carlos, to tell you, at first, I was resistant to going my dad's route. I said, I don't want to do what dad does. I want to go figure out my own path and, God willing, come up with something a bit more original. And I was going to school actually in Kentucky for business and accounting, and I like the financial side, analytics. And my dad told me, he said, "Ben, why don't you go work at Toyota just for a summer? And you can get an experience with it and understand maybe where I'm coming from a bit." And I'm glad that I did that. So I went to work there. I was in the human resource department and was supporting them with their onboarding and assessment of new hires. So we would bring groups of, call it 10 or 12 potential new hires through the facility. We would do a day of work simulation, introduce them to some of the Toyota principles and philosophy. And then obviously as part of the simulation, they were doing things that were maybe going to be expected of them on the line. Not real work, but work that was able to simulate their experience. That for me, I think, was my first exposure, and really to link back to my childhood, it explained to me the level of intentionality that maybe my parents had with me, with some of the questions they were asking, some of the way that they were developing me. And I was able to see where that came from through the Toyota way of developing their people. So I was very grateful for that experience. I think at the time I was still obviously college age, university age, and I didn't necessarily understand what I was part of with that Toyota system. I was going there most days of the week, and I was seeing all the bells and whistles and andons and hearing all the music and the guided vehicles, but I didn't quite see beyond it yet to know what it was that I was appreciating. So that opened a door to end up overseas in Australia. And this was about 10 or 12 years ago now that I made that move. Very fortunate to the gentleman from Kentucky who opened up a training organization there. I had some awesome partnerships locally and invited me over. And I spent about 2.5, 3 years in Melbourne and did some travel around that region. And with that, I think it was a fantastic experience to see lean applied in a classroom setting. We had a university partnership where we were offering a certification course in lean leadership. And I got to see value stream mapping, structured problem solving, the way Toyota teaches it, enterprise simulation, and really understand how do you teach it. But then even more importantly, I would say, how do you go apply it and work with different client companies and organizations to do that. So that has now been my journey for the last 10 or 12 years, working with different companies, organizations, meeting some great people throughout the world, and been very grateful for that experience. I enjoy that travel with a natural curiosity, but obviously to be able to link that with something you love, something you get paid to do, that's the goal as well. So that gives you a quick intro, Carlos. I'll pause there.
Well, that's great. You know what? I'm going to ask Diego and Aldo, my kids, to listen to the podcast because it's funny you told the story about how your parents kind of taught you the continuous improvement lean without you knowing, because Diego and Aldo, they're now 24 and 22, but I talked to them all the time as they were growing up about continuous improvement. And we here at home even refer to some of the things we improve as Kaizen. And so just to tell you, and I think you're right. Like sometimes kids are trying to have build their own identity, but then at the end they realize that they have so much from their parents that it's cool that you continue that legacy from your dad.
You can't argue with principles, Carlos. So that's what I started realizing as I grew up.
Yeah, you know what? That's very interesting. Since you and I met 7 years ago, I remember you told me something about principles. And I remember that you created me that curiosity to keep thinking about lean principles. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that aspect? Because I know you're very passionate about that.
I am. And if you know me, you know I like my P words. So principles, purpose, people, all the rest, problem solving. So I'll probably throw in a few here today.
Yeah.
But I think what really opened my eyes to the Toyota system and the Toyota way, perhaps, is that they looked at their system that they were creating from a business sense as a set of principles to say, we want to engage and inspire our team members in a win-win situation that has lasting value to not just the company, but something much broader, community, society, the greater world economy. And I said, well, hey, how does a company achieve something like that? And I think it's by the way they break things down to the appropriate level. They show respect at the appropriate level. If you're first coming organization, obviously they don't give you all the information all at once. It's a very structured progression. And I think looking at that, you say, man, there is so much to learn, not only from a process standpoint, technology standpoint, development standpoint, but more so from an intentionality of how do you look at generations and generations of people in a workforce that you're enlisting as part of your workforce, and how do you bring them up in a way that they can think more clearly. I would say that's the Toyota power. And what you'll see when you go into a Toyota facility is a large banner that says good thinking, good products. And you'll see it in Japanese if you're in that part of the world, whatever language in other parts of the world. And that for me is what has stood out to me, is that they focus first on thinking, second then on what do you do with that thinking to get the products out the door.
Oh, that's really cool. And I think for me and my personal journey with lean continuous improvement, Six Sigma, has been kind of the opposite. I learned these ideas a lot through the tools, which sometimes my criticism to that is that it gets in the way to that principle intentionality. So why don't you tell us your perspective about that? Because I'm sure you are good with tools, principles, methodologies. So what is your take on sometimes getting too much on the tools rather than the principles and the methodologies?
I think what has been the most powerful framework for me to reference, Carlos, is the 8-step problem-solving framework. And there are many other problem-solving frameworks, so I don't feel like I'm brainwashing you to say that's the only one. And as you start to research and learn about the other kind of toolkits, Six Sigma, Agile, whatever other project management or business improvement, they all kind of fit a similar structure, I would argue. So the 8-step for me is just a great way that it promotes consistency. And if you teach tens of thousands of employees in an organization that can all speak the same language, and you go into any facility in the world and they're all solving problems the same way, that inherently has some raw power. So I would say that's the first example of good thinking manifest and good principles. And it helps people understand logical reasoning. And it's if-then relationship, cause and effect, being able to look at something and not immediately jump to a conclusion, which we're all guilty of doing at times, and having a bit more of a closed loop or reflection. That's the most important piece of it as well, that you're learning from the if-then relationships as you're starting to go off and implement those. So I would say oftentimes we do get caught in a cycle with lean to say, let's go do and plan a little bit, but let's go do and do and do. But we don't quite come back around and say, let's check and adjust or check and act based on what we're learning. And that's where I think that 8-step is so powerful, if you get that into your head as the way that you're thinking about how to approach problems.
Oh, yeah. I've been trying to get better at that check step of the PDCA, which is when you, as you said, you just did, and then you have to reflect about what did you learn, and are you still on the right track, or do you have to adjust? And so I think that's very powerful. And I tell you, Ben, I'm impressed with your experience because you have done so many things. And so you mentioned Australia, right? And one of the kind of regions where you have done a lot of work. Could you speak a little bit more about the Australia experience for you?
Yeah, sure thing. So I mentioned a little bit about the work there and the certification course we were offering. We called that the grad cert. So it was a graduate certificate offered through a Swinburne University there in Melbourne, awesome institution. And so we would run those several times a year, and they were 3 structured weeks, but we did that over about 6 months. And there was a project at the workplace in between each block. And we had, call it 28 to 30 people in the room for each of the blocks, and we broke them into teams. And then we would be in a company environment. That made it so powerful to say during the morning, we're going to cover theory and go over some of the principles and the lean leadership as a philosophy. But in the afternoon, we're actually going to go out to the floor and we're going to meet with the team members and ask the right questions and learn how to value stream map and learn how to do a future state and start implementing that or recommend implementation. And then with problem solving, likewise, we'd have a real case study that we could break down the data and go through each of those steps. And then with the simulation, that was quite fun. It was a massive Lego simulation where we were constructing planes and different automobiles and things, and each team broke into different groups. So those were stressful weeks, but very powerful because we had a nice visual board and all the KPIs and metrics there. And I think what was so unique about it is that it was training the whole framework in a very approachable way that then for the companies in the room, they were taking that back and implementing it and realizing some great results. And so I was starting to be able to help do that investment realization for the company team members and supporting them on their project side. And that was awesome. So we worked with actually a zoo there in Melbourne, and they have 3 different locations. So we were across each of those and helping with zookeeper rounds and the front end administrative processes and how do you have customer relations going. And that was quite fun. Got to meet different elephants, giraffes, all the rest. You don't get to do that near every day. So that was quite cool. And then the other one, which was quite unique on the other side of the spectrum, was a military apparel company. They had a design center in Australia and manufacturing in Vietnam. So I got to travel there and work with the team there. And quite cool to see how it can be implemented on both sides. And from an order to cash or a value stream standpoint, when you have that many steps and backs and forths and all those materials, that was quite a powerful case study for me. And then the other neat one was a textile company, which has now actually been acquired by a U.S. A large textile company. And they also had a design center in Australia, but they had manufacturing in Southeast Asia and in New Zealand. And so I got to travel there a couple of times and be part of different trainings and events. And I think that for me was what I look back on and realize some of the most powerful experiences. We had rooms of 50 or 60 people that were just clinging to the knowledge and they wanted to hear what we could tell them and teach them. And it was my first maybe experience in developing worlds where you realize, wow, you have the privilege of being brought up in a first world society and you take for granted a bit what you're exposed to. And as I said with Toyota, being part of it every day. And I guess that's where I started to feel convicted to give back a bit and do that in a way that wasn't completely just nonprofit. There could be a nice blend. So that's always been the thought of how do you blend those worlds. But it was where I started to think, where else could I go be of use around the globe and help teach what I know at a very limited basis, obviously being young in a career, but thinking I'm confident enough, I've learned enough to be able to go start applying that. Learn on the one hand, teach on the other hand is what my father always told me. So been practicing that.
Yeah, I like that because even as you're telling all the story, I wish I was there just learning from the trainings that you were giving because as you say, I'm always trying to learn from people like you and others who are doing this and really understand and keep adding to your toolbox, right? We're collectors of tools and principles and ideas. And so then, but you also have done a lot of work in the US. So you've been in Australia, but I know that the US is another kind of area where you have done a lot of work. Why don't you tell us a bit about that and some of your lessons learned?
We'll circle back too, because I guess the conclusion to my Australia story was that I ended up in South Africa where I am today, but we'll get to that as the next step. So So the U.S. obviously growing up there and being familiar enough with the way things work and what's expected, obviously had a certain level of appreciation for it. I think also, I'll be honest, a little bit of disdain. I think in America, I've sometimes been frustrated that we have it so good, but we don't realize we have it so good.
Exactly.
So, I had a little bit of dissonance doing work in the U.S., but obviously with the right people and the right environments, you can change your attitude. So I met a fantastic mentor of mine, still work closely with him, named Michael Heisch, and he's based in San Antonio, Texas. I met him through a connection actually with my father. I'm thankful for my father's connections. He worked with him in a previous environment. I had lunch with him, and I came back from one of my trips to South Africa, and I started to appreciate his expertise, his intellect, particularly in the food and beverage industry, consumer goods. And there's a lot of context I can give you, but long story short, we worked on a project in India actually together at a cashew company in the south of India. And over that time, they don't let you drive, which is probably for the best because it's a 2-lane highway and you have elephants and all the rest. So all that to say, we would spend a lot of time in the car together, riding to the factory. And during those car rides, I think we built a rapport and a respect and looked at saying, lean, yes, agree with it from a theoretical standpoint, principle standpoint, but he was coming at it more from, I have companies that I work closely with that we need it. We need the help now. And that's what I like to have your help to do. And I think I really respected his obviously expertise, wanted to learn from him. And I took it as a view to say, I would like to invest a few years to put myself in an apprenticeship type position and be able to learn from him. So that prompted a move back to Texas. And we spent 3 years there and had an awesome experience. They work with different companies that they do a investment type approach, and they represent a family office and make minority or leverage buyout plays in different companies. And quite cool experience because you can go in and you obviously have the buy-in from the board and the buy-in from the leadership team. And that I've come to appreciate as like what you have to have when you start doing these lean type tools. And it's also just been fun because I've been able to work across many products that I love, supplements, kombucha, cashews, I mentioned. And we now work at a drink facility that does canned drinks for airlines and energy drinks and seltzers and all kinds of different things, bubble gum actually. So it was quite fun because you could do it from a financial standpoint where I have a little bit of a background, and then you can obviously take that and apply it from an operational sense, supply chain sense. I learned a bit about that as I was going through it from a sales and operations planning, commercialization of new products. So to me, it was a perfect way to say, as you mentioned, how do you expand your toolkit? How do you do it in real time for both small, medium sized, some large companies, and then be able to think, what can I learn here that can translate elsewhere in the world? So as I mentioned, still affiliated with those groups in the U.S., still work closely with them. I do travel back and forth, and I'd like to be there more often, but being there more often means I'm not here in South Africa as often. So there's always a trade-off,
Yeah. When I was talking to Andrew, and we're going to post the episode with Andrew, and he talks about how he started many years ago. And when he started, he was trying to prove that the tools, the lean continuous improvement work, not just for manufacturing and building cars, but for anything. And I think from listening to you, I think the listeners will learn and appreciate that you have done it. Like you've done all this.
Sometimes work better than others.
Right. But it's really cool to hear you speaking about all these different experiences and industries and know that for sure, like you can take health, government, education, and all these principles, tools apply, and they're extremely important to some of the things that we are now hearing more about, psychological safety and diversity. And these are things that for people like you and I, we have been exposed to that and doing that for many years. And we know that these ideas of lean are applicable to that and help us achieve that. So thank you for sharing all that experience that you have.
You've prompted one idea there, or one memory as well, Carlos. When I was first starting my career, I will confess I was quite what's the right word? Self-conscious, I guess. I was quite young. I was 21, 22 years old, standing in front of a room full of managers or even executives and professing that I knew this subject of lean and production. And I did better sometimes than others, and I think what I came back to was, how do you focus mainly on principles? Because if you speak principles, it's hard to fault those, and you're just giving your application of principles. And then my mentor also at the time in Australia had said, and you need to be aware that he said 70% of this equation is not about your technical expertise. He even mentioned up to 80%. That is mainly around how are you able to collaborate with people effectively. And you'll come to learn more of the tools, more of the technical side, more of the subject matter expertise. But if you can really come with positive energy, the ability and willingness to collaborate with others and do that consistently every day, you'll be just fine. So that's where I've now just come to realize the wisdom in that. And that's where I challenge myself every day. If I can give that, I've got 70, 80%. And then you come up the curve and you can have 10% to 15% maybe of the true expertise or ability to go off and give real case studies and examples of how to make it practical. And then I would say the other 10 to 15% is what you gain over the years of experience and the true subject matter expertise. So your point about being able to apply it in different fields, healthcare, government, wherever, I would say don't be afraid to start going in those directions if you have the opportunity to do so, if the door opens up. But then do appreciate that you have people with true subject matter expertise and you can also develop that and learn from them over time. But you are right. These are universally applicable tools and principles for truly any environment that you can think of.
That's a great insight. And thank you for sharing that, because you're right. And I will put it in terms of trust. Like, you have to gain the trust of people so that then, they listen and you create that partnership in which, as you said, as much as you're teaching, you're also learning from them, which I like that. Definitely. Right. And so now talk a little bit about what are you doing now, because you are also busy in South Africa doing great work. And you even told me that you're going to be speaking tomorrow at a conference or something like that. So why don't you tell us, what are you doing now in South Africa?
Yeah, very good, Carlos. So I first came to South Africa in 2017. As I mentioned, I recently left that role in Australia, not on any negative terms, more on terms of curiosity. And I told you that I was wondering, how can I go off and apply the lean principles in different environments? And I've always had an affinity, one for travel, two for just different environments. And so that led me to say, I'd like to go check out Africa. And that was I think a 3-month investment I made in 2017. And I said, I've got a family connection in Senegal. I'd like to go to Kenya and Tanzania and East Africa a bit. And then South Africa always sounded cool. I'd never been there, obviously, never had any real context, but I said, there's always been something neat about that accent or what it looks like in the movies. So I sent a couple emails, and the power of just good network and good community. And Andrew Paris, who we both obviously have fondness for, he was instrumental in helping open doors because he had spent several years working in East Africa and had sent several emails to people as I was going through, setting up meetings and making connections. And so I took advantage of that whole opportunity and met with many different people and just came to appreciate the good work that is being done here on the continent. And Africa is quite regional. I mean, it is hard to say it's one world. I guess ignorantly we can say it's like it's one place and one continent, but there's many disparate elements within it I've come to appreciate as well. When I came to Cape Town, it was an introduction to the Lean Institute here, which is based in Cape Town. And they are obviously part of the Lean Global Network and that group, and some great advisors and mentors through that network. And I guess with them, I realized what an opportunity that they have existing relationships. I've got my different experience and things I could bring into it. And so we've always had a little bit of a back and forth and that type of partnership collaboration. Around that time is also in that India project and the US opportunity came back. So I did have to make a decision at the time, but I respectfully said, let me park it for a couple of years and go work in the US and focus there. But I did obviously keep in touch. Those were throughout the COVID years, and throughout that time, the door that opened up truly to come back to Cape Town was with implementing Lean at the COVID vaccine rollout here. And I know it's a controversial topic, but we were doing it from an operational standpoint. So it was quite funny. We had an opportunity with the government here in the Western Cape province of South Africa and to support them as they were doing different drive-through clinics and what have you. And so that was the door that I was able to thankfully be able to step into. And I felt called, and prayer and reflection kind of led to that decision to make that move. And my US team respected that as well. And so it's been awesome. That was in 2021 that I made the move back here. And in those 3 years, have worked somewhat closely with that Lean Institute group. My initial project was with a Norwegian-owned manufacturing company here in Cape Town. And that helped open my eyes to the realities a bit of doing business from a multinational standpoint and realities of the supply chain. We'll come to talk about it here. And that's a presentation I'm giving the next couple of days with that Lean Global Connection event. And just the realities of lean in Africa and the material flow here. We have some of the worst ports in the world in South Africa. And you realize what that does when it chokes an operation and the amount of working capital that it ties up, and the disgruntledness of the whole team and the rest of the operation gets thrown into out of whack tailspin, I was going to say, but that's a little bit too harsh. So that's been interesting to see from that side. I also had a great opportunity to work with a group here that does more economic benchmarking and looks at it from an industry standpoint on behalf of government. And that was last year. I was able to go into about 50 different manufacturers, different sectors, manufacturing, chemicals, a couple there, food and beverage, and then textiles. There's a large textile operation or a presence here in the Western Cape particularly, and giving them, we call it a diagnostic. And it was assessment of where are you from an operational excellence standpoint, lean standpoint, people development standpoint. And very humbling for me. And obviously they look at you as somebody that they want to get feedback from, and they want to have your experience tell them where to go. And I would humbly say, like, listen, you go through some of the most challenging realities I've ever seen in the South African world. And I'm going to respectfully be able to give you some version, but I can't solve all these problems. It was a interesting year, stressful at times, and just stressful from the sense of what can you actually say or do that helps really move the needle in a world that's this challenging, and not challenging from the inside. It's really not things that are, I guess, not all of it's within the control of the company. Mm-hmm. Some of it's pure macroeconomic, governmental. And there were taxi strikes happening randomly that were preventing workers from getting there on time. The way that pay structure is set up on behalf of the government and some of the welfare equivalents here. So just the realities. Every day you would go in and have these conversations with leaders and hear something new or learn something new. And it gave me such an appreciation of the resilience. Mm-hmm. I think if South Africans are known as one thing, it's resilient. And there's toughness that comes with that. And I've really come to respect that. So that's also been fun there, Carlos, having a foot in both camps, one in the US, one here in South Africa, and thinking of ways that there's maybe a transfusion or a cross-pollination of things that work in one world, things that work better in the other world, and have had some fun interactions and discussions on that vein. More to say, I think the future of Africa, there's so much of population growth, obviously, as you probably heard, and demographics are also strong. There's a young generation here. So my heart really is around education in South Africa, and not just education at a young school level, but how do you apply that in a true ready-to-work standpoint? And there's some great Toyota examples, and I'm helping in some small capacity to bring over Toyota frameworks of how they do apprenticeship programs and then bring people right into the workplace with that type of thinking, but also the ability to go off and do advanced manufacturing. So that's where I get the most passion and work I would truly do for free, is helping bring over some of those educational tools that really work to develop a workforce and then implement those here. The other job I do for free, I mentioned, is fix the ports. Mm-hmm. Cape Town is officially the worst port in the world in the 2023 rankings. And every time I look down at it, I'm looking at it now, actually, and you realize, man, there's just some, I would say, straightforward tweaks that if you and a full team could go in and help make, you could really make a difference, but we're not quite there yet. So, yeah.
Well, that's great. And thank you for sharing this insight. And I just, as you were talking about your passion for education, I just know and feel that you're in the right place as far as helping others and helping leaders and young people also to learn some of the things you have learned. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people that will be inspired by your story and the things that you have done. And so I'm very thankful for that. And on that note, I do this podcast precisely for that part of the education. And I know that there's younger generations and leaders who are trying, some of them, to improve their work environment or their teams or their organizations. And sometimes they feel stuck. So what would be, maybe to end the podcast, what would you advise those people who are in that place where they want to improve things, but it's hard? So what would you say to them?
Yeah, great question. And one I always face myself as well. And where I come back to, and they tell you in different relational sense as well, can you look in a mirror? Is that your first place to start? And so when I say when you feel frustrated that maybe your company leadership's not on board with lean or improvement or whatever they're calling it, or you're not able to make as large an impact as you'd like, it's to say, how can I as a leader take a next step? And I think there's different things to say, but it's also scope of impact. If you're challenging yourself as I want to go impact the entire operation of my large corporation or multinational company, that probably is a difficult place to start. But if you say, hey, my team, my department, my area that I'm part of, how can I, as I mentioned before, begin to collaborate even more effectively and help bring in some of these tools? I would argue, Carlos, that like a management system, and that word is, I guess it's a bit vernacular, but in terms of a structure around as a team, what do we need to accomplish today, this week, this month, this quarter, this year? Having that start to be articulated, written out. What's our scoreboard? And that's I guess we Americans love a scoreboard, but it's how do we have a quick way to see how we're doing, red, yellow, green, to tell us when we're on track or off track. And then I would say beginning to implement or bring in some of the thinking around the problem solving side. And hey, where are we learning this? Can we clarify it a bit more? Can we break that down a bit more? When's it happening? How often is it happening? And just asking those questions. And I think the last thing to tie that system off is how do you have in place action items, short-term, long-term, and then those are always what you're reflecting on and saying, are we working on the right things that are a priority to us? So obviously, as you grow that out, that could be the entire company that's doing that. But at first, it could be even yourself, the way you structure your own time and your own task management to be able to have that more clearly defined. And then for your team or for your counterparts, how can you start to bring that in? So that's my initial challenge is don't try to sell the lean concepts to everybody all at once. Start being able to model that, demonstrate that, the effectiveness of it, and begin to show people the what's in it for you. And then that eventually begins to, I would say, move the needle. So that's maybe my quick wisdom of what I've had to learn over the years of where to have some solace with it.
And that is really wise, Ben, because as I always say, when you start telling others about continuous improvement, lean, I tell people the first question they're going to ask is, have you done it yourself? And I think that's going to be the first thing you're going to have to answer. So thank you for that advice and for make it so applicable. And thank you for your time and for sharing your wisdom and knowledge. I really appreciate it. And I hope that when I do the next season, we can continue to dig deeper into your world and help us understand more the knowledge that you have and share with others.
That sounds great. Carlos, I appreciate what you're doing as well. It's a quite unique opportunity to give back to the community and bring in different viewpoints. So I look forward to being a subscriber as well. But be better.
Exactly.